Part 3, Transformed by Love. Chapter 15, Changing the World One Heart at a Time. Start with your own. My search for love had unexpectedly landed me at the feet of a spiritual teacher. His presence was the only place where I felt that very same pure love that I'd experienced in the light, capital L, experience when I was 15. This kind of love, it was intoxicating, and I wanted nothing else. The Sufis say, stay away from the lane of love. It's a tavern of ruin. What do they mean by that? Well, once pure love is tasted, nothing else will satisfy you. Nothing else will satisfy the ego's pleasures because they're ruined then. As my teacher told me, anyone who has heard of enlightened truth will never be satisfied with anything less, even though it takes innumerable lifetimes to reach it. I knew I could trust him absolutely. Unlike the religious leaders of my past who demanded obedience to their authority and their traditions, he told me to give reverence only to God or the truth. He said, your commitment should be to God and truth only. Teachers are to be respected, but devotion should be restricted to only the truth, capital T. As the Buddha said, put no head above your own. This means that one's only true guru is the self, capital S. The self, capital S, of the teacher and your own self are one and the same. When he told me that, it went deep inside. But it turned out to be challenging to hear to thine own self be true. My teacher's presence was like a mirror, and I saw myself for the first time. No judgment came from the mirror. It merely showed me what I needed to see, both the innate wisdom of my higher self, but also the patterns of illusion that clouded it over. Just being in his loving energy field made me conscious of the non-love within me. So, a sorting process was activated in my consciousness, and I began to go through all of my attitudes, affiliations, beliefs, behaviors, books in my library, and so on. It was time to separate the wheat from the chaff. In the archetypal myths of the inner journey, the seeker always faces a sorting task. It seems impossible until help arrives from unexpected places. Birds, ants, fairies in some of these tales. In the ancient Greek myth, Psyche, who stands for the soul, wasn't allowed to unite with her beloved, Eros, in the myth, until she fulfilled 4 tasks required by Aphrodite, the great goddess of love. Psyche's first task was to sort through a huge pile of mixed seeds within an impossible time frame. In despair, she sat weeping. And then suddenly, an army of ants came to her rescue, and they sorted all of the seeds for her. The ants symbolize her shift to integrate a quality of consciousness that's disciplined, efficient, and interdependent. If you've ever seen ants, that's how they are. They get the job done. As I faced the task of sorting through the pile of potentials and drives in my own life, I too had to have this kind of shift of consciousness. My teacher made it clear that problems cannot be solved at the same level of consciousness that created them. Changes in the world depend on a transformation of the heart. He said, begin with who and what you are. All truth is found within. If you want to improve yourself, start where you are, with whatever is coming up for you. You don't have to learn secret codes or ancient mantras. Life itself is the best workshop. His teaching initiated a shift of my consciousness from head to heart, from changing others to changing myself. By changing myself, he said, I would be changing the world because I am a part of that world. Start where you are. This is what I heard. At the time of meeting my teacher, I was a disheartened activist. I was burned out by trying to tackle social injustices. I was exhausted from a way of teaching and doingness that aimed at changing institutional structures of injustice. I had not realized that societal changes had to start, actually, from the inside of us. As a professor, I was teaching classes on religious violence and oppression. The students reacted to the material on a personal level, and the discussions became very polarized. It was men versus women, white versus black, gay versus straight, etc., all the dualities. The students learned to assert their identities, which was wonderful, but they didn't learn how to heal their inner divides. They learned about socio-political power and not the power within. Of what ultimate good was knowledge if it didn't relieve that suffering? This was my core belief. At the time, my best attempts to enact it was to collaborate with a talented young woman of color named Lily Gomez. We taught a course together called Love and Liberation. We sought to give a communal space to examine white privilege and other layers of oppression. Student resistance was so strong in that class that Lily and I renamed the course Love and Frustration. I was focused on the problems in that kind of teaching, not the solutions. My classrooms felt like a battleground because the study was based on a victim-perpetrator model that engendered blame. It was a mindset that carried thought forms of anger and condemnation. Just like in physics, force results in equal and opposite counterforce. It was a perpetual tug of war, attack and counterattack. So to summarize, I was doing triage, not teaching, and no wonder I felt exhausted. I didn't know how to shift out of this crusade consciousness I had. I had crusaded for causes for most of my life. It was a lifelong habit of mind. It was a whole mind set. I couldn't see how things would change unless I was against something, unless I protested something. During my 20s, I had embraced the right-wing political agenda of religious fundamentalism. When I was in college, I gave strident speeches for right-wing causes. I viewed feminism as a threat to the moral order of society. I scolded my female friends for wanting to pray in public when the church said they weren't allowed to. Hadn't the Bible commanded that women be silent? I told a gay family member he was living in sin, and he wasn't allowed to visit my house. In a letter to him, I admonished, "You need to do conversion therapy to change yourself into a heterosexual." At the time, I knew nothing about the struggles he faced or the harmful effects of so-called conversion therapy. I was merely repeating what my church elders had told me. They said, hate the sin, love the sinner. What a confusing message. It didn't occur to me then that hatred of sin is still just hatred. At the time, I thought of myself as morally superior to him, and I was in a position to tell others how to live their lives. Then, in my early 30s, well, life gave me an experience of being judged and rejected. What a taste of my own medicine. The day came when it was my name that the church elders read from the pulpit. I had gone against the elders and traditions of the church, among other things, by writing a declaration for women's inclusion. This was a public statement that called for the full participation of women in the church's ministries. Even though the document was grounded in the Bible, my attitude, honestly, was arrogant and angry. The elders called me a heretic. They stood up at the pulpit in front of the whole assembly and called me disloyal to the church. Nearly overnight, I went from being a pillar in the church to being persona non grata, unwelcome and disgraced. Nevertheless, holier than thou was a hard habit for me to break. So I continued on with my moral crusading, except this time it was from the left-wing politics. Though the banners I waved were now for the other side, my energy field, it was the same, being right and feeling superior. I marched in rallies, I stood on the street corners with my inflammatory signs, one of which read, "Asses of Evil," and had a picture of President Bush and cabinet members. This seemed clever to me at the time, but it had hate in it. Disagreement with others is one thing, but hostility is quite another. In truth, I got a thrill out of that protesting. It was grandstanding. It was acrimony. It was proving my point. Even though I carried a sign that said, "Peace," I was intolerant of the other side. If a religious leader prayed to God the Father, I walked right out of that room. Wasn't that hegemony? Wasn't it sexism? Just as I had been vigilant about moral correctness when I was a fundamentalist, I was now vigilant about politically correct language. As soon as someone opened their mouth, I pigeonholed them either as an ally or an enemy. Now, where's the goodwill in that? Whether right wing or left wing, mine was a moral crusade to make the world better, according to my opinion of how the world should be. Imagine how stunned I was when my spiritual teacher introduced me to the saying of the Indian sage Ramana Maharshi, "The world you see does not exist." Oh, before this, I was certain that the world was exactly as I had presumed it to be. It was a battle between victims and perpetrators, between the right and the wrong, the saved and the unsaved. It was going to be an endless task to save the world. And by age 39, I was already burned out. I heard my teacher tell us, just because you love chocolate doesn't mean you have to hate vanilla. It seemed so obvious. Fighting against something didn't work. I wanted to be done with that crusading. But how? The only solution I can think of was to quit my job, move to another state, and get into a more holistic career. This is referred to as the well-known geographic cure. I was complaining to my friend about feeling stuck in my life. I said, "I want to leave my job. I'm so tired of academe. I feel cut off from my heart and soul. It's like a battleground. It's like I'm just living from the neck up, all in my head." She asked me, "Well, what do you want to do?" I said, "I've been accepted at a massage school in Santa Fe. I can get certified into a new profession, something in the healing arts, more holistic." And then she said this: "Fran, you really think you can study your way to a healed life? The problem is not that you don't know enough. The problem is that you don't know who you are." She was right. I needed to go inward, not fight another cause, not get another degree. I ripped up the tuition check to massage school. I packed the camper van and headed north to a forest where I could face myself. Unaware of the irony, I slid a case of wine next to the box of my teacher's audio tapes on addiction. If you remember, Psyche in the Greek myth had to sort the pile of seeds, and she was helped by an unexpected source. Remember the little ants? Well, I too was going to have to do a major sorting of things in my life, and I would be guided by someone I did not expect. Sunlight. Traveling north, I found myself on the doorstep of a wise old woman known as Sunlight. She was nearly 80 years old. She lived down a narrow country lane in the coastal forest of Northern California. Sunlight was not her birth name. She had chosen it for herself in midlife to mark a new chapter of her life. Several years before, I had met Sunlight when I drove through her town on a road trip. Though at the time I'd spent only a few hours with her and then lost touch with her, the memory of her lovingness never left me. And now I was like a sea turtle returning to its natal shore. I returned to Sunlight's doorstep. She didn't ask why I had come. If she had, I wouldn't have known what to tell her. She simply welcomed me as an old friend. My week-long visit turned out to be an initiation. Sunlight took me inward. She took me into my heart. Even though I knew and believed my teacher's message that change had to start within, I didn't know how to go about it until Sunlight. I asked Sunlight, "How can we heal societal wounds?" She said, "Changing the world happens one heart at a time. Start with your own." Now, I had been determined to change other people, often by angry insistence. So I pressed Sunlight. I said, "But doesn't anger have a place? Don't we need to rise up and be heard? How else will the world learn of all the injustices?" Sunlight said, "Isn't there enough anger in the world, and where has it gotten us? What the world needs is love, not another lashing. If you have anger in your heart, then you put anger into the world." What she said was true. I was exhausted from the years of anger. I constantly played over in my mind all the wounds from being a woman in a patriarchal society. I fought back with angry words. I took offense if a man opened the door for me, or if he used the word mankind. I got a secret, smug satisfaction out of collecting the injustices done to me. I would think inside, "See how terrible they are. They're so intolerant, so ignorant." Because I saw myself as a victim of injustice, I felt I had the right to stew in my discontent. But truthfully, my years of activism, when I stood on street corners, did protest marches, made door-to-door petitions, taught college courses on oppression, all of that had just worn me out. I was trying to save the world, but could barely save the only life under my control, which is my own. Dr. William Tiller, the physicist that's interviewed in our book, he told me, my first area of work is continued experiential development of the self, capital S. You can't continue to make progress with anything unless you feel it inside. Well, I set to work on the experiential development of self, capital S, and Sunlight was there to help me. Sunlight lived in a one-room cabin she had built when she was in her 60s. This cabin was off the grid, solar panels and a greenhouse. She'd had a former life as an activist and research scientist in Paris and New York. And then Sunlight left it all. She moved to the coastal forest in Northern California. In this setting, her life revolved around planting, writing, and serving her community in very simple ways. Sunlight lived to love and loved to live. She grew her own food, rhododendron, sprinkled reds and pinks all over her woods. The birds sang, the deer grazed. Cats visited daily. She would say, there's only one change, really, and that's the change to love. Everything else will follow. That's in her book, titled Being. And Sunlight lived this message. I saw her deslug her garden at night and put those squirmy creatures out to pasture. She was careful not to hurt worms, not to kill the ants. And I thought to myself as I watched her, a quiet life that harms nothing and no one? Maybe that kind of life helps the world more than an activist life that creates opposition and deepens the wounds of separation with anger. People want to know what to do. Well, perhaps it's equally helpful to ask what not to do, as in ahimsa, non-harming. As Grandmother Mona says, we are here for all our relations. Whatever we do to another, it's the same as if done to us. I arrived at Sunlight's cabin with my case of wine in the camper. Spending time with myself is how I said it. It was my euphemism for drinking alone. Alcohol was my go-to friend. After leaving the church as persona non grata, I felt bitter, lonely, unwanted. The church had denigrated my love orientation, my sexual orientation. The church had rejected what felt like the core of me. So I had turned to another spirit for company, alcohol. Alcohol was a spirit that gave me an escape from that psychic pain. There was a genetic predisposition toward alcoholism in my family, and drinking soon became a physical, emotional addiction for me. I awoke in the morning thinking of wine, and I couldn't get through the day without a bottle or two or more. I hid bottles in my desk drawer at my university office, and then I would chew gum to mask the smell of it. Heavy daily drinking had deteriorated my health. It affected my job and became a major barrier in all of my relationships. What an irony! I had just published a biography of the best-known prohibitionist in American history. Truthfully, I had written the raucous story of teetotaling Carrie Nation and her saloon-smashing hatchet crusade as I poured one drink after another. I wanted to stop. but felt hopeless I ever could. Some alcoholics are binge drinkers. Others are daily drinkers, and I was a daily drinker. I couldn't imagine writing without a drink, making love without a drink, going to a party or watching the sunset or eating dinner or falling asleep without a drink. Drinking was easy to rationalize. I could always think of someone who drank more than I did. But deep inside, I was concerned about myself. What was wrong with me? I'd been raised with the motto, where there's a will, there's a way. This implied that I could overcome addiction through sheer ego will. But I'd never seen it work in the lives of family members. I tried several times to stop drinking through sheer willpower, only to feel more like a failure when the self-coercion failed to work. I was long past the early drinking years when it felt good. I was drinking now because I had to. I didn't understand addiction. Why could some people enjoy a couple glasses of wine, but I had to drink a bottle or two? On the drive to Sunlight's house, I had listened to the audio tracks by my spiritual teacher called Consciousness and Addiction. This teaching was very compassionate. It was eye-opening. He said that addicts and alcoholics are not bad people. They are not moral failures. There are genetic, physiological factors that make it extremely hard for them to stop the substance. And most importantly, he said, these are people who have a yearning for bliss, for happiness. And he said, that's our birthright. Their reliance on spirits is the expression of a deep spiritual longing for joy and for boundlessness. He referred to the 1961 letters between Bill Wilson, who's the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, and C.G. Jung, the famous psychiatrist. In these letters, Carl Jung said that the alcoholic's craving for alcohol was related to the spiritual thirst for wholeness and a union with God, unio mystica. In other words, addicts and alcoholics have the right goal, just not the best method. Carl Jung wrote, the formula is spiritus contra spiritum. That is, in order to recover from an addiction to the spirits, one needs a path of the spirit. My teacher said, never be ashamed of your longing for bliss. This is your destiny. Just change your technique. Keep your aspiration. This way of holding addiction was revolutionary to me. It wasn't based on fear or punishment of some kind of sin, but on the power of love. It affirmed my innocence and my dignity. As I was listening to that audio, I deeply felt the longing to be free of the drinking and to experience the real happiness and bliss that he was describing. But how would I ever quit? I had tried many times without success. Pride had gotten in the way. I hadn't been willing to admit I really needed help. My teacher said that humility is the open sesame. When we're humble, we unlock the door to truth. And this invites in the help of unseen forces that are waiting for us to ask for help. He liked to give the example of Bill Wilson, whom he had known in New York. Bill Wilson's moment of surrender is very famous. It turned out to be a portal of freedom for millions of people across the world. It happened in 1934. He was admitted for the last time to Towns Hospital. Doctors told his wife, Lois, he was hopeless. Hopeless alcoholism. And they advised her to put him into an asylum just so he wouldn't hurt himself or her. He was only 35 at the time and absolutely plunged into despair. He was an agnostic. The idea of a God who could help him seemed ridiculous. But there he was alone in his hospital room, and there was nowhere else to turn. He had nothing. He cried out, "I'll do anything, anything at all. If there be a God, let him show himself now." The effect was instant and dramatic. Suddenly, Bill's room filled with an unbelievably bright white light. The atmosphere was electric. He felt an elation beyond description. It was greater than any joy he'd ever known. In that state of ecstasy, he knew he was finally free. As the light began to subside, he felt a presence in the room. He called it a great reality, capitalized. He thought, this must be what religious people call God. It gave him infinite peace, and it never left him. He never drank again. That light had transformed him. Out of that experience, Bill Wilson co-founded the organization Alcoholics Anonymous, which is one of the most inclusive, transformative global spiritual movements of the past century. I listened to this story as I was driving along. I wondered, did our individual breakthroughs really benefit the world? The case of Bill Wilson was one thing, but what about the rest of us? My teacher was emphatic that it was precisely our own inner healing that helps the world. He said, if you endeavor to evolve spiritually, this is the greatest gift you can give. Pouring out the spirits. I wasn't planning to tell Sunlight about my drinking problem. It just tumbled out of me. It was a winter evening, and we were sitting and warming ourselves in front of her wood stove in her little cabin. The kitty was purring. I could hear the whisper of the wind outside. Somehow it felt safe to share my burden with her. I said, Sunlight, I think I have a drinking problem. She said, with a bit of a smile, people who don't have a drinking problem don't usually say that. Okay, Sunlight, I know I have a problem. I want to quit, but I don't know how. There, I had said it. The secret was out. What she said next shocked me. Fran, it's possible to quit. I can say that because I've been sober over 30 years. What? I said. My eyes got big. I couldn't believe I hadn't known that Sunlight was an alcoholic. She ignored my shock. She just carried on with her story. One day I hit bottom and I reached out for help. I was having blackouts. I couldn't remember what I'd done the night before. I'd wake up in strange places. I'd get my phone bill and see I'd made long, expensive calls to Europe. But I couldn't remember what I had said or who I'd talked to. I saw I was getting worse and worse, and I knew that I might one day end up on a sidewalk in the Bowery, which is New York Skid Row. I'd just be left alone to die. I knew I had to ask for help. So someone invited me to a recovery meeting. I was ready, I guess. As they say, I was sick and tired of being sick and tired. Listening to Sunlight tell that, I was just stunned. I couldn't imagine her being drunk like that. She definitely didn't fit my image of an alcoholic, and for that matter, neither did I. Sunlight went on with her story. They told me at the meeting, just don't pick up that first drink, 1 hour and 1 day at a time. The problem of the alcoholic is that if we take the first drink, we can't stop. So that really was the only way for me to not have the first drink. And that day was the hardest one of my life. I was terrified. My hands were trembling. I had a splitting headache. But somehow I made it through the day without a drink. Then it was another hour, another day, another hour, another day. And now it's been 3 decades. Giving up the drinking was just the beginning. Then it opened the door to love. Sunlight and I, we shared our experiences openly late into the night. Before going to sleep, I poured out all the alcohol that was stockpiled in my camper van. The liquid spirits were gone. With Sunlight's help, that major sorting was accomplished. Later, I learned that her story was published in a book that is studied daily in group meetings around the world. Amazing. When we are ripe for change, life has a way of putting us in the right place at the right time with the right person. Sometimes, the best gift of love is simply to let the other person be. You give space, don't intervene. And this was exactly how Sunlight loved me. I was at a crucial crossroads in my life, and she helped me sort out my drinking issue. She didn't lift the weights for me, but as soon as I was ready to try, she spotted me. She didn't tell me I had a drinking problem, but as soon as I said I did, she was there to listen. She didn't advise me to stop drinking, but as soon as I said I wanted to, she was there to share her own experience. In my first few days of not drinking, Sunlight took me along on her community activities. I learned a lot simply by listening, by observing. We went to a church service where there was a man who had lost his wife, and he was attending a grief group run by the minister. I heard him tell Sunlight, "I've not been involved spiritually for 45 years. I thought to myself, yeah, it's good for him to be here. He needs some love. Well, Sunlight was thinking the opposite, and she said to him, "You have a lot of love to give here, don't you?" His eyes filled with tears. Sunlight had seen his soul. On another occasion, I told Sunlight I was seeing colorful auras around people. I wanted to know what they meant. I was feeling special, thinking this is a sign that I'd arrived to a higher spiritual level. It had happened spontaneously one day when I was at an academic conference. I was so bored by the theoretical papers being read, I just went inward and melded into a statement I remembered from my spiritual teacher. He said, "Everything reveals the miracle of existence and therefore is equal to everything else." I was in a meditation with this teaching, and then I looked around the room and registered the equal holiness and preciousness of each person. At that moment, each one lit up, and around their head appeared a beautiful white light. At first I thought, oh my goodness, what's going on with the lighting in this room? I thought it was a mechanical malfunction, or I thought something was wrong with my eyes. And then I started to see colors around different parts of their bodies: blue, yellow, green, orange, purple, black. Each person was an energy field made of light and colors. It seemed that each person had the potential to be the full rainbow spectrum, only if they had owned their own wholeness, and no one had. I felt that something of their beautiful nature was being revealed to me, something more essential about them than their ideas or their physical appearance. The conference lasted for several days and the phenomenon continued. I noticed that the colors around people would vary. I wanted to know the reason for this, so I asked Sunlight, "Sunlight, what do the colors mean? If I knew, then maybe I could help people." Sunlight looked at me as if she felt sorry for me, as if I had missed the whole point. She said, "Fran, can't you just enjoy the colors? Just love people from your heart. That's what heals." Sunlight had been used to seeing auras and colors and the light everywhere. Yet she never sought to gain anything from it or analyze it. Life was illuminated for her, and she kept it to herself. Sunlight was an ordinary person who had discovered the secret of love. She didn't talk about it much. You just knew it was true. She was always saying to me, "Love isn't something to talk about. It's something you are. It's something you radiate from inside." Still, I would press on with my questions. I just felt desperate to understand certain things. I asked her, "What about romantic love?" Because you see, I'd always associated love with romance, with being in a couple. Sunlight said, "Love is universal energy and gives us our own completion. Therefore, love doesn't require an outer partner or a lover. I'm completely happy by myself. It's nice to have a partner, but love doesn't depend upon having a partner. Love is who you are. Love is present everywhere." Sunlight had had many partners in her life, but now she lived by herself, and she viewed everything as a part of love. She said, "I see love in everything." When I looked at the plants in her greenhouse and how they grew in vibrant agreement with that, tomatoes, green peppers, flowers, Sunlight said, "I see that we all are really one. I never feel alone." And when I was with Sunlight, I could almost feel the oneness of that love. But not wanting a lover, a partner, that special someone to share life with, I couldn't imagine life without romance. Later, as I went on this journey of love, I would encounter many couples. They showed me that a romantic partnership could be put into service to the power of a greater love. I met Belvy Rooks and Didon Gills one time when Sunlight took me for breakfast at Queenie's Roadhouse Cafe in Elk, California. Elk is a remote town with a population of 200. What an unlikely location in the middle of nowhere for me to meet her friends Belvy Rooks and Didon Gills, who just happened to be there the moment we stepped in the restaurant. Sunlight hadn't seen them in a long time. So she turned to me and she said, "Fran, there are no accidents. Would you like to meet them?" Later, as they spoke of their experience as longtime civil rights activists, standing at the door of no return at Almina slave dungeon in Ghana, Chills went up my spine. I just couldn't believe their story. Their anger at racism had been transformed into a vision of healing for the whole planet. They were no longer stuck in the mindset of us versus them. I knew Belvy and Deaton would be my teachers on the path of learning how to love my enemies. Over the following years, that's exactly what happened. I met with them several times to discuss this book and their teachings to share in it. As Sunlight and I drove home from Queenie's Roadhouse Cafe, I couldn't get Belvy and Deaton out of my mind. How had they made the shift from us versus them to a global heart? I asked Sunlight, how do I get rid of my anger? When I think of all the injustices done to me, I just boil inside. She told me to make an inventory of all of my hurts and resentments. Yes, I rolled up my sleeves and wrote through the night all the terrible things that they had done to me. And then I read my long list of hurts to Sunlight. And she said, okay, now look just as closely at your own motives as you do at their mistakes. What were you expecting from others? What was your part in these situations and interactions? I'm sure I looked quite bewildered, but she was quite matter of fact. She said, Fran, you're resentful against others. You're quick to see their faults, their prejudice, their intolerance, their ignorance, their greed, their egotism. You see them as the enemy. But aren't these things also in you? Was she crazy? Hadn't she heard how I'd been mistreated? How obviously terrible those people were? How unfair, how unjust the situations? I didn't protest, however, because it was Sunlight. And somewhere in me, I knew it was true. Whatever I hated in them was also in me. If not, how could I have recognized it in them? As my teacher had told me, you're always looking in a mirror. Sunlight said, Fran, if you can face your own darkness and come to love all that you discover there, then you will be a force for good in this world. Love all the parts of myself that I've pushed out of view? Sunlight was asking me to know and own all of myself. My self-pity, my arrogance, my egotism, my hypocrisy, my prejudice, my self-hatred, etc. And then I had to come to love all of that? It seemed impossible. It was easier to be a beggar, to always need something or someone outside of myself to validate and love me. Sunlight finished with this clincher. One day, Fran, you'll see that the enemy is not another person or group. It's the ignorance inside all of us. I heard her words, but I fought against them. I was still attached to a paradigm of polarity, of the oppressed against the oppressor. I said to her, well, don't you care about equality? Sunlight spoke slowly and firmly. She said, I care more about oneness. Equality was the battle cry of my generation, and we all fought for it. But equality can never be achieved because it stems from separateness. Oneness is what I care about. This is the consciousness that I choose to live. Oneness carries the knowledge of our wholeness and our interconnectedness with each other. It includes our differences, but not as adversaries. Those of us that fought against inequality fought for a good cause, but it was still a mentality of us versus them. We were committed to nonviolence, but we used the word oppression as a psychic weapon. If the end goal is oneness and respect for each other's dignity, then the means we use must carry that same respect. There's simply no place for self-righteousness and blame. Everyone has been hurt by oppression. This is the starting point for any change. I challenge Sunlight on one last point. Well, okay then. How did you deal with homophobia? She grew up in the United States at a time when gay people were considered criminals. I knew she had faced a lot of prejudice and hatred. How could she not be angry about this? How could she not feel like a victim of injustice? Sunlight simply replied, how did I deal with it? Unconditional love, over and over again. I asked, what do you mean by that? She said, love that's not unconditional is not love. We have to love ourselves completely because all of us are created by a loving creator who loves all of creation. And then also, we extend our love to those who hate and judge us. Her reply was resolute. There was no room left for any more questions. She said, listen to the wind outside, how it moves through the trees. I had to empty myself in order to listen. Sunlight said, love is like the wind. It touches each tree differently. Some rustle, some whisper, some bend, some break. And it's not up to us to ask, why this way, not that way? Our work is to see, to really know and to feel that love moves through all and is in all. And with that, she asked me to read some poetry by Mary Oliver, whose poems take a reader into the dimension of love that moves through all things. One title of a poem, where does the temple begin and where does it end? I read for a while and then we fell into a peaceful silence. The kitty was curled up on the window seat and purred. The fire crackled. The rain gently pattered. And the wind blew through the meadow grasses. The trees seemed to sing and sigh in the wind. I listened with empty ears and heard what I'd never heard before. After about an hour of this beautiful silence, Sunlight looked up at me and she said, Fran, you've done good work here. Now it's time for you to leave. There are some things that can only be learned in solitude. I've arranged for you to stay at a friend's cabin a few hours north of here. We call it the Moon Cabin. It's deep in the forest, and you can stay there as long as you like. As she said that, I noticed that her eyes shone from an inner light, which made it very hard to leave. Belvy Rooks and Didon Gills showed me the critical link between inner wholeness and societal healing. They say that on the path of love, our enemy is our best teacher. I heard the Dalai Lama say at a gathering, "The enemy is our teacher. Without the enemy, how can we learn tolerance and forgiveness? If you want to learn compassion, then thank your enemy." Well, Sunlight had said a similar thing. "The person who despises us is also a part of us," she told me. Unconditional love requires that we find a place in our hearts for those who reject us and abuse us. I felt the truth of this, but I had no idea how to live it. The story of Belvy Rooks and Deedon Gills showed me how.